Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. We're back. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, so happy birthday, America. 4th of July coming up tomorrow. And surprise, surprise, the Republicans did not manage to screw it up as they have repeatedly. Well, actually, both parties have been screwing up midterm elections in the first 2 years, but the Republicans managed to get this right. They passed the one big beautiful bill for Donald Trump. And of course, that means a lot to the country because they've got a lot of policy program or policy law written into this bill to effectively provide what Donald Trump promised on his campaign. So we're going to go over that a little bit, but let's go through the preliminaries here. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating and the shows and the information coming. So if you enjoy the discussions, the lectures, the topics, the guests and the hosts on the other programs on the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the Liberty Works Radio Network. That's all one long string. LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website and get signed up as a subscribing member, even if it's as little as $15, $20 a month. Every membership helps, and we do need your support to keep the network broadcasts operating and the shows coming your way with the information that nobody else in America is delivering to you. And, of course, if you want to get fully informed on the unconstitutional fraud known as the federal personal income tax, you need to find your way over to taxfreedom.com and start reading, because the income tax has been killed and nobody wants to talk about it. And the reason why I say it's been killed is because for the last 50 years, since 1975, actually it's more like 1955, for 70 years, the federal government has been forcing the income tax as though it were a new power to tax directly and without limitation everything that you do, allegedly under the 16th Amendment. And of course, that's been a complete and total fraud. The government has labeled any attempts to argue that the income tax is not a direct tax because the Constitution prohibits the direct taxation of the American people. That's been labeled as frivolous because the 16th Amendment allegedly authorized a new power, despite the fact that there's no enabling enforcement clause in the amendment to constitutionally authorize Congress to write any new law for any alleged new power allegedly created by the amendment. And of course, it's all been a total fraud. And we have absolute proof of the fraud now in two forms. One is the constitutional authority statement for the new income tax law that was passed in January of 2018 by Trump in his previous administration. The constitutional authority, the specific intent of Congress in enacting the law, is recorded in the congressional record, which is required to have a constitutional authority statement placed on the congressional record for every single bill before it becomes debatable on the House floor as potential legislation. So what was the constitutional authority statement, or rather what was the claim to constitutional authority that was made in the congressional record for the passage of the new income tax law in 2018? According to the DOJ, the IRS, and the lower courts, it would have had to have been the 16th Amendment, because that's what they've been arguing and enforcing in the courts fraudulently while labeling any other argument as frivolous. So what did Congress write in the constitutional authority statement for the new income tax law in November of 2017, before it came to the House to be debated in December, before it was signed into law by Trump, effective as of January 1, 2018? What the constitutional authority statement declares is that the constitutional authority for the federal income tax is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. It's not the 16th Amendment. And of course, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, the only powers enacted are the indirect powers of the taxation of foreign activity, foreign persons, and in foreign places by impost, the taxation of exported goods by duty, and the taxation of commodities, licenses, and corporations by excise. There is no power to tax the labor of the American people under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, because the impost duty and excise powers don't reach the labor of American citizens conducted within the 50 states. The whole thing's been a fraud since the victory tax in World War II, which was actually the first time in history that the federal taxing powers reached the labors of the American people. So the constitutional authority statement from Congress specifically contradicts the argued claims of the government in court claiming it's a 16th Amendment power to tax directly without limitation, which is, of course, complete and total fraud. How do we know? Because the Supreme Court ruled a year ago in Moore et al. v. United States, June 2024. The article is on my website, taxfreedom.com. You can read about how SCOTUS killed the income tax and how the system has been broken, completely broken, basically since World War II, but particularly since 1980 when the circuit courts all started making up this direct tax under the 16th Amendment nonsense, which they should have known was nonsense right from the beginning, which tells you the judges have betrayed you. They're ruling from a seditious mind to undermine the Constitution and your freedom and turn you into subservient slaves who exist only to pay off the debt of Congress owed to the Federal Reserve Bank, which is where all your money goes. None of it goes in the Treasury to fund the operation of the United States government. That's not happening. That's why you have to file a return. The money's supposed to have already been deposited in the Treasury after it's withheld from your paycheck all year long. It's supposed to be deposited on a quarterly basis. So how come on January 10th it hasn't already been recorded at the Treasury that you've paid X thousands of dollars in taxes as a result of the money withheld from your pay? It doesn't show it because none of the money went in the Treasury. It all went around the Treasury to the Federal Reserve Bank. And then on April 15th, when you file, you get a credit for tax for all the peonage debt service you voluntarily provided through the course of the year by letting them collect tax before tax was owed, before tax was due to be paid, and then using those monies unconstitutionally and fraudulently to service their own $37 trillion in debt that you have no obligation to pay. It's a totally unconstitutional system that destroys any semblance of a constitutional tax system and replaces it with an 11th century peonage plantation system of involuntary servitude servicing the debts of your master on the hill. That's Capitol Hill rather than Plantation Hill. And the role of the king, of course, is played by the Federal Reserve Bank, who controls Congress through its ability to manipulate the funds and money and what it's focused on in our society. And of course, right now, the Federal Reserve Bank is focused on screwing Donald Trump. They refused to lower interest rates despite the fact that the inflation numbers had fallen, despite the fact that Main Street is starving for capital. The Federal Reserve Bank and the judges have made themselves the enemy of America to force you into this involuntary servitude system. So it's a complete and total fraud. The constitutional authority statement from 2017 exposes it as a fraud. The Supreme Court's decision in Moore et al. Exposes it as a fraud because, of course, in Moore, the Supreme Court holds that income taxes are indirect taxes and do not have to be apportioned because they have to be uniform. Well, I'm sorry, but how is graduated taxation uniform? It's not. The whole thing is a fraud. And I've gone over this before, how they've swapped out intrinsic uniformity amongst the citizens for a geographical uniformity that allows them and opens the door to the taxation of every single class in America, just regardless of how discriminatory it is. And according to them, under the theory of geographical uniformity, it's all perfectly okay as long as all the members of that class that's identified in the legislation, whether it be black or Jewish or Christian or Muslim or gay or straight or male or female, any discrimination against those persons would be fine, according to the theory of geographical uniformity, as long as all the Jews in every state were treated the same under the law, as long as all the Christians in every state. So you can write a law that taxed Jews at 95% and Christians at 5%, or Islam at 100% and Christians at 5%, or blacks at 5% and whites at 90%. Or the gay at one rate and the straight at another, the male at one rate and the female at another, or the young at one rate and the old at another, or the Italian at one rate and the Irish at another. And all of this discriminatory law, according to the judges, is perfectly okay as long as every person of each class is treated the same within the states. Now, this is absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. The ability to use graduated tax brackets dates to a number of Supreme Court decisions in the 1870s, 80s, culminating with Pollock, where the court held that the use of tax brackets is legitimate because it's based on the power of Congress to discriminate against the inanimate articles of commerce and commodities subject to taxation, and to discriminate against the privileged corporate person, licensed person, and foreign person. And thus, you can discriminate against these classes and have different rates of tax dependent upon how much revenue, income is earned from the privilege enjoyed. But where there is no privilege enjoyed, there is no tax that can apply. And citizens don't earn money by any type of privilege like incorporation or license. They earn money through their exercise of the right to work. And the proceeds of that right to work are not subject to any impost on foreign activity, duty on exported goods, or excise on commodities, licenses, or corporation. And that's why they've had to lie to you since 1942, telling you your labor is subject to tax and making it a direct tax because there was no way to tax labor indirectly by impost, duty, or excise. So they made up the direct tax in order to push their socialism, which is what income tax is. It's the mechanism by which the wealth is taken from the productive and the intelligent and given to the sloth, the non-productive, the uneducated, and the dead weight in society in order to buy the votes of that poor dead weight. And the politicians think that if they can just buy enough votes of the poor, promising to deliver all the wealth that they see around them enjoyed by those who work hard and got educated, rather than those who didn't work hard and got drunk. But the socialists promise the poor, ignorant masses the wealth of the wealthy. And of course, they go off and vote for socialism and end up being enslaved for the rest of their life to the income tax, which doesn't apply to the wealthy because they only pay at a capital gains rate. Ask Mitt Romney and all the others. So you've got the wealth paying at 13%. Well, the poor get taxed at 40%. Or the middle class. Okay, we got the first commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed. We'll be back in 5 with more on more. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we're just going to get right back into this. As we came up on the commercial break, I was talking there about how the income tax has been exposed as a complete and total fraud by both the Supreme Court and the Congress. But the Justice Department and the executive branch, the IRS, don't seem to want to get on board with the new ruling. They think they can still argue for federal abortion under Roe v. Wade, regulatory deference under Chevron, and probably affirmative action too. They just don't seem to understand that there's a new law and new rulings from the Supreme Court which displace the circuit court opinions, the erroneous circuit court opinions that have been used to communize America and its revenue system. And I say communize because the second plank of the Communist Manifesto is a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. That's where you find graduated taxation of the people. Divide them into classes, set them at warfare with one another in the streets, and then let the warfare play out as class legislation destroys the sense of unity, allows the politicians to buy votes from the poor by extorting the wealthy and compelling everyone to service debts, which is what the government runs on, not a tax system that raises revenue. So the whole system is a fraud. So, as I mentioned when we first started, they passed somehow, the Republicans didn't screw it up, they passed the one big beautiful bill, which that's how they've labeled it. And it turns out that's a pretty nice 4th of July birthday present for America because it's going to make permanent the cuts to the income tax that we're going to revert to the higher rates and numbers associated with the tax before the change in the law in 2018. And of course, this tells you that the political class still doesn't understand the income tax is a complete and total fraud, and they're probably not going to get on board until the American people's conscious awareness of that truth has spread so far that it's become a tidal wave, threatening to wash away any politician that insists the communistic system in place today needs to be sustained while the debt is run up to 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 trillion. At what point will it explode? As goes the currency, so goes the fate of the nation and the quality of life enjoyed or suffered by its people. Either we stop the Congress from continuing to run the currency out into oblivion, or we will all wake up in the Depression of the 1930s with a worthless currency that can't be exchanged for anything, and the price of gold at what, $1 million an ounce? Or unpriceable in the currency because it's virtually worthless, except for trading goods in the nation that printed it. And then, of course, you need the wheelbarrow full of notes to buy the single loaf of bread. History repeats itself where the lessons aren't learned. And the Democrats obviously have not learned the lessons. And of course, the Republicans aren't paying attention either. But the Democrats are actually voting communists into the candidate position, as they've done in New York with this guy Mamdani, who is an avowed anti-Semite socialist. He wants New York City to run the grocery stores. You mean the way Russia runs the stores and provides bread and cheese sometimes and nothing else? Well, what are you going to grow in New York City? What do you think New York City is going to be able to afford to put in the grocery stores? You don't really think there's going to be a lot of steak there, do you? It's going to be bread and cheese, because that's all the state is capable of doing. If that. So the Democrat Party has gone insane, and the Republicans appear to be on a roll. This big, beautiful bill does everything that Donald Trump promised he would try to do as he ran for office. It makes the tax cuts permanent, it prevents the tax increases that would occur from not making the tax cuts permanent, it prevents them from occurring. It addresses the immigration and border issues that Joe Biden completely destroyed by letting an additional, 10 to 15 million illegal aliens in? 10% of them, 1 million to 1.5 million criminals? Whether or not they're really reformed, we're going to find out, aren't we? But you can be sure most of the criminals have not reformed. They've just changed location. And the Democrats don't seem to care. They think it's more important to give them housing, food, and medical care rather than citizens or veterans, because they're buying the votes of the 15 million illegal aliens they let in. And they are registering them to vote. In the state elections. Oh, the state elections, right. It's like they'll certainly be able to tell whether an election is state or federal and abstain from going to the polls. Yeah, right. If you believe that, you died 3 years ago. So you've got peace in the Middle East breaking out. All of Iran's proxies have been shut down. The Houthis aren't interfering with Red Sea traffic. Hamas is pretty much out of business in Gaza. Hezbollah has been shut down in Lebanon. Iran has been taken out of the nuclear game and is suing for peace. To talk about it, it looks like the Abraham Accords may expand. Israel may sign a treaty with Syria. The price of oil is down. And the world's business markets didn't react to Trump taking out the Iranian nuclear capabilities, which you would have thought might impact the world's oil markets. But they didn't care. Price of oil is down, and stocks are up. They just hit, I think, an all-time high, going over 45,000 today on the Dow. So, and the economy is going along. They signed a trade deal with Vietnam. All of these things that everybody said would create the end of the world if Donald Trump got in and did it, they're all being done, and they're creating strong economic consequences for America. If we had access to capital with a slightly lower interest rate, say 100 basis points, America would be off to the boom again. And of course, as more and more trade deals are signed and concluded with other nations, they got one with Vietnam today, India is coming, they're still talking to China, who's going to have to sign a deal pretty soon because the economic circumstances in China are deteriorating rapidly. They need to restore access to the US markets without penalty, which means they're going to have to drop tariffs on at least a certain number of American products in China to allow us to sell into their markets. And in the past, they haven't honored those agreements were established, but at least getting them to the table and negotiating said agreement is a step in the right direction. Hopefully they honor it. But again, so things are going well for Trump. He's on a roll. Everything he has promised to do is in play and occurring. And like I said, the economy is not faltering, and the stock markets have recovered from the initial shock of Trump announcing he was going to impose tariffs and interfere with world trade, except that was never his intention. Nor was it his intention to substitute the income tax with tariff revenues. He assumed and put in place the tariff revenues and assumed that position to bargain from. He put in place tariffs to immediately give him leverage in negotiating new trade agreements with all these other nations, which had no tariffs, had no incentive to come to the table and negotiate new trade agreements. So in order to compel them and give them incentive to come to the table and negotiate new trade deals where the tariffs on American products in those foreign markets would be substantially reduced or removed, he imposed tariffs on their products as of immediately. And that, of course, has created the initial shock, but it's also bringing the foreign governments to the table, and they are renegotiating the deals. And Trump is getting better deals for American companies to be able to sell into these foreign markets. And the stock market apparently likes it now that they see how it's going to play out. And now that they understand it's not his intention to replace taxation with tariffs. Of course, you couldn't do that anyway. They were able to do that in the early part of the 19th century because it was a small government that wasn't welfare oriented and passing out 60% of the budget. And it funded only the legitimate operations of the federal government, not these expansive, intrusive operations in energy, agriculture, education, healthcare, and all the other nonsense that the federal government has gotten into through the judges of the federal courts holding that more and more authority is able to be wielded by the federal government in these areas through the regulatory deference created by Chevron, which has allowed the agency bureaucrats to write their own laws and invade the state's jurisdictions, both territorial and legislative, with entities like the EPA, OSHA, and such, for which there is no constitutional authority. These are not federal functions in the 50 states. The only place those types of agencies can have authority is inside the federal government. And the EPA would have authority over navigable waterways within the United States, but nothing else. They have no authority to monitor the air or the water. This is all made up nonsense. They have no authority to tax labor or to dictate energy policy to the 50 states. All of this is unconstitutional communism. Communism. Clearly, it's socialism. They're trying to interfere in private sector energy production. And of course, once they engineer the shortages, then they use the shortage of energy as an excuse for the state to step in and take over the whole grid, which is what's already being argued in California. Oh, look, the blackouts and rolling brownouts. They can't keep it on because the legislature is interfering in the business. All of this nonsense about green energy, wind farms, and solar projects, it's all nonsense. You know why it's nonsense? Because they lied about the infrastructure capital costs and their lifetimes. All of the wind powers are based on economic projections analyzing a 30-year lifespan of the capital. It takes a huge amount of capital up front to subsidize the build out of the infrastructure for these things. And if the windmills don't last 30 years but only last 20, which is what's happening, you have to reinvest all the capital again in 20 years, and now your economic model never turns a profit because it doesn't last 30 years. It only lasts 20, and you have to put all new capital at higher rates, at higher costs, back into the project again. And that means it will never be economically viable on its own. It's economically viable only because the government subsidizes the infrastructure cost. But they're not going to subsidize the rebuild. That means the rates have to go up. And solar panels aren't lasting 20 years, they're lasting 10. So when the capital infrastructure has to be reinvested in half the time that the economic viability was calculated to be based on, the whole system becomes nothing but a loss operation. You're not making money, you're not producing cheap energy, you're taking control of it to prevent the American people from having it. Okay, we're coming up on the second commercial break. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. We'll be back in 5 with more. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network, and I'm going to change topics here again and go back to talking about the misapplication of the income tax. So, in order to try and get more persons in the United States government aware of what has happened and how the income tax has been exposed by both the Congress and the Supreme Court as a complete and total constitutional fraud, I've been writing letters to President Trump, J.D. Vance, Pam Bondi, Commissioner Long, and others, trying to expose the income tax to them. Now I'm going to post this letter that I've written up on the website at taxfreedom.com. Anybody who wants to send a copy to any politician, their state representative, their state senator, the White House, anybody in the government that they think needs to be informed of what's occurring, what's happened, and where things have gone wrong and how, I would urge you to get a copy of this letter and send it out. This one was written to Commissioner Billy Long, and Billy Long is an ex-congressman who spent most of his career in Congress trying to abolish both the IRS and the income tax. So I'm hoping that he'll be receptive to the letter that I sent him just a few weeks ago. So I'm going to read the letter, and if anybody wants a copy, again, you can either contact me at tom@irszoom.com for a copy, or you can probably download it off the website. I think I'll be able to get it up on there before the weekend. So this is to Commissioner Long, trying to get him to understand how the agency that he's in charge of now has become a complete and total constitutional fraud, with the intent of giving him the information and law as a weapon to begin to rein them in and make them operate within the law, since he's in charge of it now and he's always wanted to get rid of this. Well, here's how you do it. You make them practice the law as written, as held by the courts, as recorded everywhere. Okay, so let's just go ahead and do this. I am writing this. Dear Commissioner Long, I am writing this letter and including the enclosed documents to efficiently inform you, as the new Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, of the absolute sedition being perpetrated by the IRS within its de facto operational practices enforcing the federal personal income tax on the American people in America. The constitutional sedition I am exposing herein has also been perpetrated by the attorneys of the U.S. Department of Justice in the federal courts, in all personal income tax enforcement actions, and in the income tax trials of American citizens, both civil and criminal, for the last 45 years. It is now a fact that the enforcement of the federal income tax by the IRS in the field and the DOJ in the courts has been exposed by the Supreme Court as a complete and total constitutional fraud in its decision taken in Moore et al. v. United States, 602 U.S. 572, 2024, relevant excerpt attached. This Moore decision of the Supreme Court clearly exposes the fact that the IRS's enforcement of the income tax and the U.S. Department of Justice's prosecution of the tax in the courts as a non-apportioned direct tax under the 16th Amendment has been the single largest constitutional fraud ever perpetrated on the American people in the history of our country. This fraudulent enforcement of the income tax for over 50 years by the IRS and the DOJ against the American people as a non-apportioned direct tax on income under the 16th Amendment has been done in the name of tax only, because the Supreme Court decision in Moore makes it absolutely clear that no such taxing power is granted by the Constitution or the 16th Amendment, and that therefore there is no such direct tax on income that exists or that is constitutionally authorized to be enforced as a non-apportioned direct tax on income under the 16th Amendment, that is without subjectivity to any constitutional limitation. But that has been the erroneous institutional argument position of the federal government, including the IRS, the DOJ, and the lower federal courts, all of the U.S. tax courts, the district courts, and all 13 U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeals for over 45 years now, since 1980. See the attached IRS DOJ frivolous positions document excerpt. So, the federal government, including the lower courts themselves, have actually been the source of this unaddressed sedition and insurrectionist rebellion against the Constitution that has been ongoing in the federal courts since at least 1980, 45 years, as the attached documents show. Sir, everyone in America knows that there is something very, very wrong in America with the way the IRS operates and treats the American people. This information that I am delivering to you in this letter explains exactly what is fundamentally wrong and why. And I sincerely hope that you will read and reread this letter as many times as is necessary for you to completely understand what has been done to and happened to America through the maladministration of the federal personal income tax by the United States government. Sir, I believe President Trump needs to be immediately informed of these matters, and his Justice Department and Attorney General Pam Bondi should, of course, be interested in exposing and terminating exactly this sort of ongoing, unconstitutional, governmental, and judicial fraud that is still being perpetrated by literally the entire executive and judicial branches of the federal government in all income tax cases tried in the courts today, excepting now the Supreme Court itself, finally, after 50 years, which is the court that issued the Moore opinion, which plainly exposes the blatant constitutional fraud that has been and is still being perpetrated on the good American people by the lower courts, the IRS, and the DOJ through the de facto practices created under the repugnant judicial legislation that has brought the false belief of a non-apportioned direct tax on income under the 16th Amendment that is without subjectivity to any constitutional limitation into existence. It's brought that false belief into existence. Sir, for the last 50 years, the IRS has been operationally assessing the federal income tax against the American people as a non-apportioned direct tax on all income under alleged authority of the 16th Amendment, based on nothing more than sources of gross income under Section 61, which is erroneously misapplied as the basis for the direct taxation of income under the 16th Amendment, based only on having sources of earnings, which is not a legitimate or proper constitutional basis for the federal taxation of the American people under Article 1, Section 8 by impost, duty, and excise. The problem is that in Moore, the Supreme Court says that the income tax is part of the granted indirect taxing powers of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and is therefore not a direct tax on income under the 16th Amendment, because no such taxing power is granted by the Constitution. And thus, that direct tax on income allegedly authorized under the 16th Amendment doesn't legally exist under the Constitution or the 16th Amendment. It's been a constitutional fraud. Sir, for the last 45 years and still today, the IRS and the U.S. DOJ have been erroneously arguing in the federal courts that the personal income tax is a non-apportioned direct tax on all income under alleged authority of the 16th Amendment. And that is the patently unconstitutional direct basis upon which the tax has been wrongfully enforced without limitation, resulting in the destruction of the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of innocent Americans who owed no tax at all on the fruits of their labor derived from the simple exercise of the citizens' right to work. This, of course, means that the federal courts, i.e., the U.S. tax courts, the district courts, and all 13 U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeals have erroneously been acting unconstitutionally and therefore unlawfully for over 50 years in all civil and criminal tax litigation and trials for income tax, because they have been acting without a constitutionally granted subject matter jurisdiction of the court that can lawfully be taken over the legal actions filed by the government seeking the enforcement through the courts of that alleged non-apportioned direct tax on all income under the 16th Amendment. That is a 100% fraudulent claim to a subject matter jurisdiction in the courts, because the Supreme Court effectively says in Moore that no such direct and unlimited tax constitutionally exists as a granted power to tax that can be enforced in the courts outside of the constitutionally authorized law. So for the last 45 years, the federal U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeals and the lower district courts have all been ruling and holding that the federal personal income tax is a non-apportioned direct tax on all income under alleged authority of the 16th Amendment to be enforced against American citizens as an unlimited, graduated, direct tax on all earnings, redefined as gross and taxable income under Section 61 and 63, and not as the constitutionally authorized uniform, not graduated, indirect tax on income that it was originally enacted as under the original legislation of the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913, and as it was specifically declared to be in the Brushaber v. Union Pacific Railroad Company decision of 1916, which the circuit courts have seditiously reversed with their rebellious operations over the last 45 years, effectively unconstitutionally enforcing the second plank of the Communist Manifesto in place of any legitimate constitutional indirect taxation of income by impost, duty, and excise. But now the Supreme Court holds again in Moore, as they originally did in Brushaber and Stanton v. Baltic Mining, that income taxes are indirect taxes under Article 1, Section 8, not a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. But the erroneous belief that the federal personal income tax is a non-apportioned direct tax on income under the 16th Amendment has irrefutably been the argument position of the executive and judicial branches of the federal government since 1980. And that is plainly and clearly evidenced in the attached frivolous position document excerpts that the IRS has published and that the DOJ has relied upon for 40 years in citing circuit court decisions instead of the Supreme Court decision in Brushaber that repeatedly erroneously assert and hold that the federal personal income tax is a non-apportioned direct tax on all income under alleged authority of the 16th Amendment. Well, to make a long story short, the Supreme Court's ruling in Moore last June that income taxes are indirect taxes under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and are not direct taxes under the 16th Amendment at all, exposes completely the extent of the rebellious sedition being perpetrated by the IRS, the U.S. Department of Justice, and the lower federal courts, which sedition and rebellion has been ongoing in those courts and inside the IRS and the DOJ for over 50 years. In order to assess the federal government in its decades-long effort to socialize the American people utilizing the Social Security and welfare programs, all funded by the unconstitutional class legislation of the federal income tax. Okay, maybe I'll get to the end of this next week. I hear the end of the show coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Find your way over to taxfreedom.com, get informed, and get a copy of this letter and send it in. Thank you. You too.